the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Budgetary Oversight Committee and indeed the Parliamentary Budget Office for the sterling work and reports that have been carried out this year. This budget, of course, today was framed against a background of severe challenges, the impact of a possibly hard Brexit, trying to keep an open border with the North, Trump's American First policy, our over-reliance on corporation tax from a small number of multinationals, the ongoing desperate housing crisis and health waiting lists, and of course climate change and all the issues as highlighted yesterday in the intergovernmental panel. But the budget I think that was presented was at best, Minister, a kind of a holding exercise. Sadly, I think familiar budget principally for the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil elites and their supporters, of course, in the property industry. And while the National Treasury Management Agency is efficiently carrying out the necessary refinancing of our national debt this year and into 2019, the sheer burden of the £201 billion debt as a percentage of GNI StarCan and in real terms is a sombre backdrop to our economic performance, and that, I suppose, and the amount of money we're paying now year on year to the European Union, our net contribution, we're one of 9 net contributors, as you know, it does show that a lot of our funding is pre-committed and limits the ability of even a radical government to address our major concerns. But as I indicated several times to the Minister for Finance at the Budgetary Oversight Committee, and despite the recent surge in corporation tax in 2019, I still believe the introduction of the Rainy Day Fund should not have happened this year and should have at least been postponed into the early 2020s. And the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, of course, has correctly criticised this proposed £1.8 billion fund as half-baked at present. The Budgetary Oversight Committee and the Parliamentary Budget Office, of course, are still waiting for information on whether this fund would operate as a counter-cyclical policy tool and/or an emergency fund. So I think had we not embarked on this course today, we would have indeed had an extra £500 million to have spent on vital current services such as health, education, disability and housing. Last week I delivered my own pre-budget submission to the Minister, which I entitled, Minister, A Budget for All Our People. And the key expenditures I outlined in my own submission were roughly 3.5 billion, and the necessary revenue-raising measures I favoured would have yielded at least 2.7 billion. Regrettably, of course, one of the most opaque areas of our national finances is the lack of transparency and accountability in costly tax expenditures, as well as, of course, the tax avoidance which other deputies have referred to. And included, of course, in those tax expenditures are the crash era losses set against current companies' tax liabilities. And constituents, of course, are often very angry that companies like Bank of Ireland and AIB and indeed other similar companies, which are now again very profitable, that they're not paying normal corporation tax in addition to, in the case of the banks, to the bank levy. For years now I've been calling on the government to declare a housing emergency and introduce emergency legislation along the lines of FEMPI, but for housing. But the housing package announced today, it's merely a rehash of earlier announcements and promised spending. The net additional social housing construction and acquisition capital spending seems to be only 210 million, with 69 million for servicing local authority sites. Of course, the over-reliance on the private rental sector for accommodating those with social housing needs through HAP, RAS and rent supplement will be greatly exacerbated by this budget. There are almost 70,000 households being accommodated in this way now, and today's changes, of course, will add another 17,000 households to the very uncertain future of living in a HAP house, Minister. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil's total reliance on developer-led housing, of course, has created the major uncertainty in relation to our ongoing vast government expenditures in the private rental sector. And Taoiseach Varadkar and his alt-right colleagues in Fine Gael still relentlessly oppose direct construction of social housing by the local authorities. And indeed, looking at some of the changes today, how will renters be any more secure following the removal of interest deduction limits by landlords, or how will the increase in infrastructural funding to 50,000 per subsidised home. What indeed will that do to assist our homeless? I'm a member of the informal Oireachtas group, as you know, Ceann, on disability, and I urge the government to introduce a €20 a week cost of disability payment. But all we got today, Minister, from your colleague and yourself, from Deputy McGrath, was a commitment to look at this important initiative, a study costing €300,000. And we've had the Oireachtas group presented, in fact, a multi-annual investment programme of €211 million per year, starting this year, or starting in 2019. But as far as I can see today, we're only receiving 150 million additional spending for 2019, and obviously some of the demographic changes will use up a lot of that. And as with housing, of course, the government's response to the ongoing crisis in the health sector has also been incredibly lacklustre, and the lengthy waiting lists of over 700,000, of course, have become the norm as citizens languish in pain, and our two-tier system exacerbates inequality. And I mean, where are the extra beds that we were all expecting today, Minister, or indeed in your own South West cardiac services? Like, why did that not happen today? We were expecting some major initiatives in all of those areas, and only 206 million out of the proposed Vote 38, the health vote, in 2019 has been allocated to Sláintecare implementation. But I notice that the Sláintecare Integration Fund itself only receives 20 million, and in that section of the budget expenditure report, Minister, as you know, the 206 million includes additional funding of 55 million for mental health services and 20 million for the National Treatment Fund. Yet only a few weeks ago, Minister Harris told me that almost 190 million was needed to implement the Vision for Change strategy. Small restoration measures for social welfare recipients and pensioners, of course, in recent budgets have been welcomed, but I thought the Minister might have gone that bit further today, perhaps a basic €7 a week increase across all payments, which the Department of Finance put at just under 500 million. But the increase that's been granted and full restoration of Christmas bonus, of course, are welcome. But I think the Minister could have done much more for our most vulnerable citizens. But as highlighted, I think, in the National Economic Dialogue, I believe Budget 2019 should have addressed the feminisation of poverty. And there are many priority measures which should have been taken to address this. And I do welcome, by the way, the €150 in earnings disregard for lone parents. I think that €20 is very welcome. But given the growing feminisation of poverty and homelessness, Minister, it's unacceptable that the Department is not fulfilling a key recommendation of our Budgetary Oversight Committee that an equality budget statement would be prepared and read out by the Minister beside the budget today. He refused to do that when he met us recently. And why, as the Department of Expenditure and Reform, why aren't you using the switch model in relation to gender income inequalities? When we met the teaching unions and my teacher constituents, the key demand was pay equality for young teachers, lower pupil-teacher ratios, increased capitation rates and restored necessary middle management. But the current and capital budget increases, as far as I've been able to make out, Minister, they're just under 500 million. They do little but address the demographic needs of our population. For example, only 4 million will be provided in extra capitation in 2019, and the increase in the national training levy, of course, finally moving towards 1%, is welcome. So I think the Revenue Commissioner's Statistics and Economic Research branch did give us clear information on possible income, USC and other key tax changes, which could have been very, very positive. But I think I do welcome the change in the standard rate band and also the slight improvements in tax credits. But I believe the national minimum wage should have been increased to €10.50 an hour, as against the Minister's €9.80, because we should be trying to reach over a year or two, or at the latest, the national living wage of €11.90 an hour. I think there were many other steps the Minister could have taken. I proposed, for example, in my own budget submission, Minister, I proposed a 43% tax on incomes greater than 120,000, which actually would have yielded very significant additional funding. I also supported Deputy Mick Wallace's proposal for the vacant site levy tax 25%, and Deputy Wallace might know that, in fact, the Department of Finance costed that levy. If we went ahead with it, it would give us an additional 105 million down to 2020. So there were many positive, much fairer and more egalitarian tax initiatives that this government could have taken. But in many respects, I think the Minister did have scope for a much fairer landmark budget today, even allowing for Brexit and the other severe external challenges. But once again, I think Minister Donoghue, he chose the Fine Gael spin over substance route. The budget he's delivered, despite what the media may headline tomorrow, it's essentially a standstill exercise, as I've said, to see how the wind is blowing, Minister, from March 2019, and whether another budget 2019 will be necessary. And it particularly fails citizens, of course, who are in housing need and those who are ill. Thanks, Las Can.